Hello and welcome to today's event, Digital Service Delivery Enhancing the Citizen Experience. I'm Dustin Heisler. I'm Chief Innovation Officer for Governing, and I'm excited to be the moderator for today's event. I just want to thank you all for joining us. It's going to be a fun 60 minutes as we dive into digital service delivery across the country. Before we begin, just a couple brief housekeeping notes. A recording of this presentation will be emailed to all registrants within 48 hours. You can use this recording for your reference or feel free to pass it along to your colleagues. Today's webcast is designed to be a virtual panel, and you can participate in Q&A with the panelists throughout the presentation and not just at the end. We're shaking things up. You can ask questions using the Q&A box at the bottom left of the presentation panel. Please send in your questions as they come up throughout the presentation. And if you have a question directed at a specific panelist, make sure to reference that on your Q&A submission so we can get it to the right person. Also, if you'd like to download a copy of the slides, you can do so by clicking the Webinar Resources widget at the bottom of the console, and you'll be prompted to download a PDF of the slides. During today's webinar, you'll be able to connect with your peers across LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Please use hashtag GovLive to connect with your peers across the governing platform via Twitter. And at the close of the webinar, we'll encourage you to complete a brief survey about the presentation. We'd love to hear what you think. If you're unable to stay with us for the entire webinar but would still like to complete the survey, simply click the survey widget at the bottom of the screen to launch the survey. Otherwise, it will pop up automatically as soon as the webinar concludes. At this time, we also recommend you disable your pop-up blockers, and if you're experiencing any media player issues or have any other technical difficulties, please visit our webcast help guide by clicking the help button at the bottom of the console. Today, joining me to discuss this very timely topic are Jay Nath, Dominic Viana, and Brian Wick. Jay is the Executive Director of City Innovate, a San Francisco-based nonprofit that helps government agencies address challenges through emerging technologies. Nath became San Francisco's first Chief Innovation Officer, where he served for more than a decade. And prior to public service, Nath was the VP of Product for SquareTrade, which was acquired by Allstate, and was a senior consultant at PwC. Dominic Viana is the Deputy Director of Operations for the City and County of Denver's Department of Excise and License. He is responsible for the issuance of approximately 180 business licenses, complaint investigations, compliant inspections, and continuous operational improvement efforts. He has recently focused on delivering new and innovative customer-facing enhancements by leveraging technology and streamlining business processes. Because of these efforts, Denver has moved 50% of its customer volume online, and lobby wait times for customers have dropped 60%. Viana has also been engaged in municipal operations for more than a decade, and he has overseen some of his most innovative implementations in Denver, including Denver's parking systems and developing a capital project improvement program control. Dominic graduated from Regis University with a degree in political science and studied at the University of Denver's Joseph Corville School of International Studies. He lives in Denver with his daughter Liliana and his husband John. And finally, Brian Wick. Brian is currently the Vice President of Product Marketing for Excella. He previously spent over 20 years in the software industry, focusing on process automation, BPM, and knowledge management solutions for companies such as Adobe, EMC, OpenText, and several startup companies. So we have the right people assembled to dive into the state of digital services across the country. So the flow for today's presentation, part one, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the barriers related to digital transformation. So exploring common barriers and challenges that hinder government agencies from modernizing and improving their digital services. Part two is going to be focused on tomorrow's technologies today. Here we're going to look at a few of the technologies that have helped government agencies modernize services and how you can get your arms around them. And then part three is about digital tools, best practices, and benefits. We're going to take a step back to discuss takeaways about service delivery benefits local governments should expect after adopting new technology, and then highlight some strategies and tactics that you should consider when procuring and deploying these technologies going forward. So let's dive in. So right now, digital services are trending. You may read govtech.com or a variety of other publications, but digital services is a phrase that is almost synonymous with smart cities when it comes to the frequency of use. We've seen everyone from the federal government with U.S. Digital Service to a senator's recent efforts to actually introduce a U.S. digital service budget down to the local levels. We've seen California with the Newsom administration propose a new Office of Digital Innovation that models that of the U.S. Digital Service, and a variety of other activities that are happening across the country. So all of this effort is really focused on improving service delivery for constituents. It's at the core of all state and local technology priorities across the board. In fact, what's on the screen right now is the latest CIO priorities from the Center for Digital Government, going from states down to cities and counties. And you'll notice that each of these priorities are experiential in nature. They're all focused on some level of digital services and digital service delivery, whether it's through cloud and software as a service applications or getting into citizen experience or mobility and mobile applications. Everything is really focused now on these experience-based technologies, and digital services sits at the center of that. Now, when we look at what some of the top digital service drivers are across the country, we can kind of nail them down to 5. Number 1 is the rise of new citizen and business expectations. Accenture did a survey that showed 85% of constituents across the country have, if not the same, greater expectations on government than they do the private sector. So let that sink in for a moment. Citizens expect more of government than they do the private sector. So agencies can no longer sit on the sidelines and wait to see what the private sector is going to do. Citizens are now expecting government to move ahead and to be ready and to anticipate their new needs. Number 2, the pace of change in technology adoption is accelerating. We've seen as everything has become virtualized in government, people expect and adopt technologies very differently than they did in the past. You think about how applications roll out and can become viral within an instance. I mean, look at Slack and kind of the whole collaborative services arm that's really expanded across the country. These are all examples of how the pace of adoption has changed, and people are finding ways to use technology to solve problems in their own terms. Number 3, we've got operational challenges that require a new model, whether it's legacy information technology structures, cybersecurity challenges, the rise of data silos that exist inside government agencies. We have a ton of operational challenges in the public sector that we now have to solve, and technology is now able to solve those down to the local levels of government. Number 4, we have more available market capabilities than we've ever had before. We call it the government app store moment. There's now new capabilities tied to a specific platform that you can use, just like you can find an app on the iOS App Store to solve a variety of challenges. No longer are you locked into large-scale, multi-year enterprise agreements. You now have the ability and flexibility in the public sector to find a solution that solves a specific problem that you're looking at solving. And number 5, there's a shift in how technology and services can be deployed. And that's driven by SaaS and cloud and a variety of new infrastructure that actually makes it possible to find the right application, the right solution, the right service to solve the right problem for your constituents. Now, with all of this said, there are barriers associated to what digital transformation is possible in the public sector. And in a recent survey that we did, we wanted to look at how digital service and digital transformation was actually being done in government today. And what we found is that 25% of digital transformation initiatives were being driven by leadership, whereas only 15% were rolled out from an enterprise-wide standpoint. So the takeaway to that is that a lot of these things are siloed and fragmented, and so there's an opportunity to connect the dots when it comes to that. In fact, in a survey that we commissioned with Excella and the Governing Institute, we found that there were a great variety of approaches when it came to digital transformation in government. Some has been incremental, some has been directed from the top down, as you can see with our first 2 on here. 16% of respondents said it had been siloed, and only 15% indicated that there was an enterprise-wide initiative. So there's a lot of opportunity to kind of look at connecting the dots and taking an enterprise approach. Now, the top 5 barriers that I see as I go around the country talking to CIOs, number 1, the survey data hit the nail on the head, having no vision, plan, or strategy that goes across line of business with how technology can actually solve problems collectively, not just in one area. Number 2, existing legacy technology investments. We have to acknowledge that sometimes we've invested in legacy technology, and how do we make the business case to migrate to some of the newer technologies? How do we move from a CapEx model to an OpEx model? So these are a lot of the conversations that we've been having for many, many years, but they're still a hindrance to digital transformation. Number 3, funding. How do these new funding models play out? How do we actually pay for these things, and how do we budget for them, and how do we kind of move into that operational model of technology? Number 4, staffing is a huge area. So, we've talked about the silver tsunami, we've talked about the cultural challenges in government, but just the new staffing skill sets that are required in order to support some of these emerging technologies can also slow down the pace of digital service transformation. And then the last thing is when it comes to legacy procurement models and really moving beyond the standard ways of procuring technology and getting into more iterative approaches to how we actually embrace technology. So I want to bring in our panel now and kind of dive into these barriers and we'll roll through kind of what you can do to overcome some of these things. And so the first panelist I want to bring in is Jay. And so Jay, you're the former Chief Innovation Officer of San Francisco. You're now the Executive Director of City Innovate. Tell us about some of the most common barriers of digital transformation that you've seen in government.
Well, thank you, Dustin, for having me. Really excited to be having this conversation. So after 12 years in government working in San Francisco, one of the biggest barriers that I experienced was making sure that we had leadership. Is there a city leader that's a champion around digital transformation? Second, does your city have a strategy in place, a digital strategy that aligns with your community's priorities? Is that user-focused, making sure that citizens and frontline staff are really part of that digital transformation? We also know that you need to invest in your staff. Do you have training programs? Are you hiring people? Have you changed your job requisitions, job descriptions to really invite new talent? We've obviously seen that at the federal level with USDS and 18F. We're seeing that in the state of California. We've done that in San Francisco. But there's so much opportunity to really sort of level up the skill sets in your organization. I also think that procurement has been a big challenge for around digital transformation, and it's something that we've been focused on for the past 5 years, as you mentioned, this iterative, streamlined approach where you're really focused on outcomes, not prescribing exactly what the technology should do. And so we've seen that now, as you mentioned, in the state of California. We're working with other jurisdictions on that, and procurement is a key blocker, and so making sure that you have a process that's really streamlined. And last I want to talk about is culture. It's really important that we start evolving the culture in our agencies and departments to really see technology as a partner and really helping us reach our goals. And that's something through our Startup in Residence program. We really work with our cities to evolve that culture. And what we do, our strategy around that is to, one, work with forward-thinking leaders. So who are those departments and agencies where they're actually looking towards innovation? Second, focus on the goals, not the technology. Senior leaders in your departments and agencies are not going to want to talk about machine learning or things like that. They really want to solve those problems, so focus on that. And last, make sure that you understand the needs of your agency. Do a little bit of homework before you go and have that conversation with your department or agency. And last thing I want to say is that we've seen a change in sort of the culture of external partners, vendors, where they're really becoming more of a trusted advisor and a collaborator rather than just a vendor. And I think Accela has done a great job in doing that broadly through their work, and also working through our program at Startup in Residence. They've been a great partner working with our startups. We have over 40 startups on, how do you approach government? How do you think about really creating value for the departments and agencies and the citizens that you're serving? So there's a bunch of challenges, but the good thing is we're seeing a lot of leadership across the country that are establishing best practices around this area.
Absolutely, and that's perfectly aligned with what we're seeing at the center. So looking back kind of on those challenges, the leadership aspect, strategy, staff, procurement, culture, what should cities doing? What should people on this webinar be doing to overcome those barriers or to at least prepare for them today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if you're a senior leader in your organization, make sure that you've got the executive champion. Is that your city manager? Is that your mayor? And you need to convince them to lead on this. That is really, really critical. Once you have your champion, you need to make sure that they understand digital trends and technologies. So how do you do that? I'm really a big fan of briefings, executive briefings. So bringing in experts from industry, folks like Brian Wick here on the call, bringing in government leaders from maybe surrounding jurisdictions that have done good work. And I think there's nothing like FOMO, getting them to see other cities that are really doing good work and getting recognition and showing that they're really making impact around that. A great example of this was a Chief Innovation Officer in San Jose. In her first few months in office, she did an executive briefing half day with the city council and the mayor around digital transformation. And so brought in industry experts. I was able to join a bunch of folks throughout the day to really tell a story about how cities are doing this. And so that education is really, really important. Second is making sure that you've got a digital strategy in place. And that digital strategy needs to be focused on governance. It needs to be inclusive. So make sure you bring in all of the departments and agencies and not just it's an IT-led thing. And make sure you've got the right people helping you, both inside and outside, to develop that plan. Now, if you're not a senior leader, I think you need to focus on building a peer network. Who are those change makers in your organization? Everyone has those. You need to find them. They're often working independently, and they are sort of banging their heads against the wall. Work together to build that coalition. It could be brown bags, seeing what other cities are doing, finding wins within your organization, and really driving that culture change. That's really, really important. Those wins, your senior leaders might start seeing that and trying to accelerate that. And the last thing I'll make a plug for is join innovation programs like Startup in Residence, where we bring startups and governments together over 4 months to solve problems through a streamlined process. And those types of programs can really transform the organization. They get those quick wins, low-hanging fruit to really solve problems. And an obligatory plug, we're inviting cities to join our network. We have over 20 governments. So if you're interested, check out our website and apply by April 30th.
Absolutely. Startups in Residence is a great program, so thanks, Jay, for that. So I want to bring Dominic into the conversation now. When we think about digital services, oftentimes we think about existing processes that we have to modernize, but Denver's been at the forefront of a lot of major shifts in the regulatory environment, from short-term rentals to cannabis regulation. So Dominic, I'd love to learn about what are some of the collateral impacts or challenges of being the hub of the future of the regulatory environment in government.
Thank you very much for having me, Dustin. This is exciting. Looking at how Denver has really kind of dove in and looked at these new frontiers of regulation, the first thing that you run into is that unknown or the unexpected components of the regulation. In our experience, most everything has been done before in some sort of fashion. You just have to look back. You have to peel back the onion and understand how that technology has been leveraged previously. Looking at, for example, our short-term rental regulations, we have a very similar record to what it's looked like for example, security guards. The business process in some instances has been very much the same. And so you just have to go through and reimagine it, go through and have a better understanding, while being mindful of, those unexpected components. Another challenge is staffing. When we brought on short-term rentals, we were looking at bringing in 3,000 people to the regulated environment, of course, without the correlating staff increase. And that's something that we've seen time and again with whenever we go into a new area of regulation. And so you have to find those efficiencies and leveraging those existing partnerships to figure out how to go through and how to actually bring it to the forefront. And then some other challenges have been, going in and modernizing, looking at a lot of Denver's regulation. A lot of it was put in place 10, 20, even 30 or 40 years previously. And that was great for the environment and the customer expectations at that time. However, we found our customers do not want to come downtown. They do not want to, have that in-person experience with the city. And so you really have to expand the presence and you have to meet the customers where they are in order to provide them with the best service that they can find. And so working with your partners, you go through and you get a better understanding of what is available and how you can go through and how you can present and leverage that existing technology to deliver it to the customers moving forward.
That's great. So in thinking about the fact that other cities are now starting to kind of be thrust into this new, emerging regulatory environment, and they're now starting to have to grapple with how do I keep up with some of these things? How do I deal with cannabis, short-term rentals, scooters, a variety of other issues? Any words of advice, kind of looking back on what you did in Denver, that you would recommend that cities kind of be looking at as they're starting to be disrupted by a lot of these new regulatory environments?
Absolutely. I think first you have to understand your policy goals. You don't want to be a slave to an existing, business practice just because that's the way it's always been done. So going through, looking at the policy goals, understanding what you're trying to deliver to the constituency, and then framing it that way, not, blocking yourself into history just because that's where you're at. And then I think, looking to be nimble, being able to make adjustments with the policy or the practice as you go forward. And part of that is getting out ahead of it and leveraging those partnerships. For example, looking at the scooters, I know they invaded San Francisco before they came to Denver. And so working with our partners there, understanding how they brought them into the regulatory framework and how, you look at a new dynamic, problem, for lack of a better term, or something that's different, and being able to address it by, understanding both the context locally and how it has been looked at previously with other operators. So those are two components. Looking at cannabis, you also have that. Oh, go.
Those are great. I'd love to hear your thoughts on cannabis too.
Yeah, you've got the federal challenge and being able to thread the needle so that you stay in line with the federal government, making sure that you don't go too far outside, making sure that you are meeting the constituents where they're at and being able to provide a service to them. And if you can't provide the ultimate service which they would like, being able to support them in their efforts, through having at least streamlined technology and the ability to deliver well-crafted policy.
Absolutely. Citizens expect it, and we have to be prepared to deliver upon it. So, Brian, I want to bring you into the conversation as well now. So you work with cities across the country on modernizing the regulatory experience, which is an important aspect of digital service delivery. What are some of the drivers for transforming digital services today that you're seeing in government across the country?
Yeah, sure, Dustin. And we do work with a lot of agencies, so we see a lot of, the drivers that are driving, them particularly across jurisdictions and so forth. I think we touched on one. The first one is really the citizen expectations and your comment that, they're not wanting to match the consumer world or their consumer experiences, but exceed that. And we see that all the time, and that's really one of the key driving forces for agencies. In the consumer world, it's all digital, fast, and easy. And expectations of business apps like Amazon or eBay, drive those expectations in citizens that want that same experience with the government. They want 24/7 availability. They want it to engage on the device of their choosing. And then with all the data needed to complete a transaction or interaction quickly. The second thing I'll mention, and it's been touched on a lot, is the changing nature of regulation. It's fast and evolving, and the agencies that work with Accela are coming to us and saying, hey, we've got to really accelerate the ability to take applications for permits or licenses, whether that's recreational cannabis, now moving to hemp. Hemp is something that we've started engaging with and working with certain agencies on. It's different from cannabis, but similar, but there's enough differences that we have to start, getting expectations and requirements set for the potential hemp industry going forward. Short-term rentals, we've talked about that. The overall sharing economy with bikes and scooters and cars, and the future with drones and so forth. So when these things change and agencies start having to take applications for permits, licenses, and so forth, they often need, systems quickly. The third is about employee engagement with working with up-to-date systems. And so some of the agencies that we deal with, if they're really Gen 1 or paper-based systems, they struggle with employee engagement and productivity. And so with digital systems, employees can actually do more. They're happier at their job. There's less frustration and workarounds. In the process automation world, if you get it wrong, if any employees are out there doing things on their own, like using Excel spreadsheets or Access databases, just to get their jobs done because they want to do a good job and they can't within the environments that they're given. So workarounds are absolutely, what we need to identify, understand, and then, build into plans for digital transformation. And again, with employee engagement, it all leads to morale improvements, better hiring, better retention, and so forth. The fourth item is really the speed of business. Now this is the expectations of the developers or the business owners that need to start, generating revenues and get their businesses off the ground. And agencies are really trying to accommodate that increased speed of business. And really, sort of overall, it's the desire and need to provide environments to create thriving communities, which is all of our agency contacts and customers. That's really what they're trying to do. They really want to make a difference in their communities, create thriving communities. And long processing delays means friction in the development process. And, and again, it's all about providing better service levels for their customers.
Absolutely. One thing to echo on to kind of the emerging regulatory environment, we've been tracking emerging regulations, and out of the states that are in session today, there's over 1,000 bills that have been filed that touch on drones, AI, blockchain, 5G, IoT, that have direct implications on state and local government from a regulatory standpoint. But the interesting thing is over 150 of those bills have actually been enacted. So that wave of, the future regulatory environment changes is coming, and agencies need to be prepared for that. And that kind of brings me to my follow-up question for you, Brian. What role does industry play in this process in helping cities on their path to digital service transformation?
Sure, and a great question. I mean, these digital projects are not easy. They're large investments, but they pay off well when done correctly. And so we can guide cities in their choices and approaches beyond providing the technologies to enable this new process automation. I mean, at the very highest level, we'll provide guidance into projects with just, suggestions such as, not paving the cow paths. And sometimes agencies will come to us and say, well, we've done it this way for so long, it would be challenging for us to change. And, so we want an automated system that takes our current process flow and just pulls the paper out of it, just automates it, turns it digital. And so we advise them to really, let's take a step back and understand, digital transformation or optimization isn't about paving the cow paths. It's about creating, looking at workflows step by step and looking at things that are certainly required, but some of those things that may have been perceived to be required but actually aren't, especially in a new digital world. Other things are, considering all the various upstream sources and downstream uses of data, and how does data play a role? Now that it's available through an automated and digital process, the value of data in decision making and analysis is something that's critically important to understand as organizations get into these projects. And one thing, and it sounds so intuitive, but we still sometimes fight this, is never ever introduce paper back into a digital process. And when it comes to phasing in projects, sometimes that kind of goes to suggestion number one, is understand the flow, understand the data flow upstream and downstream, and then never ever assume that paper has to come into the process. One aspect that we're hearing is the desire to help citizens who require cross-agency or cross-jurisdiction efforts in their process automation, again, maybe a permit or license. And many do. Many require moving data across an agency or across a jurisdiction. And so we want to ensure our customers, to be ready for these future requirements in the systems they implement, in the way that they manage their data, the way they build connectivity and collaboration into the solutions. And so Axcelis Civic Applications are a great example of how we provide these approaches, and help create the path to digital service transformation. They're just designed to be more out of the box with faster implementation and built-in best practices, so that when we engage an agency based on all of the other implementations that we've done over many, many years, we can come to the table with more than the technology. We can come with the domain expertise and some best practices, and then offer an out-of-the-box solution. And there's lots of good reasons why they want to, go that way versus building a large custom implementation. Makes the journeys much easier, more cost-effective, removes risk from major projects, because the agencies are going to know what they're going to get from the outset. So those are just some of the things that come to mind when you ask how we can help our agency customers along their journey.
Yeah, those are great, and that's a perfect segue into tomorrow's technologies today. So in looking at kind of the investments that agencies are making in technology, we've noticed that digital services are definitely front and center, and they're coming into focus. So these are the top 5 areas across states, cities, and counties that we project increased spending in 2019. And you'll notice, cloud is top, shared collaborative services, getting into citizen engagement and experience, so, kind of a key pillar of digital services. These are hot areas of growth. But one of the most interesting things that we've seen is a shift in what agencies are actually investing in specifically. So this is a breakdown of state and local IT budgets based on function of spend. So you've got staffing, communications, hardware, software, IT services. And you'll notice that hardware is actually on the decline. So, and software and IT services and kind of managed services are something that we're seeing really trend and grow year over year, which further validates the need and the model of digital service delivery. In fact, one of the surveys that we commissioned with Accela to look at areas most impacted by regulations is kind of front and center with all of this, and that's around inspections and oversight, followed by permitting. So these are hot areas of growth that agencies are looking at modernizing and putting in a digital environment today. And then looking at the top kind of growth areas around that, we've talked about many of these today, from short-term rentals to scooter to ride sharing, but the future is going to be rented, and agencies need to be prepared with a platform to actually deal with that. And so I want to dive into this next section and bring Dominic back into the conversation and talk about, from Denver's standpoint, what role does technology play in your ability to keep up with emerging regulations?
Technology is critical to our overall strategy in dealing with these new regulations. As these pop up, we're looking for, speed and affordability, and that's something that a SaaS solution really provides to us. I mean, looking at for short-term rentals, one of the critical components to it is meeting our customers' expectations, right? We know how to regulate, we know how to license, but one of the challenges is, putting something online and giving the customers that online environment and experience that they aren't just looking for, but they've come to expect. If it's not intuitive, if it doesn't meet their expectations, it's our experience that they're going to avoid the licensing. So meeting them where they are and working with our partners that do have that expertise to deliver that online environment so that they can make it through the permitting and licensing process. That is a critical component to it. Also, maintaining that infrastructure is costly. Maintaining that infrastructure is something that we find ourselves migrating away from as we try to rely on more of those cloud services moving forward. And then looking to deliver something that's out of the box. That is something, going through and building some sort of highly scripted, highly customized license or permit might sound good initially. However, when you go into maintaining it and you're trying to leverage a lot of those existing partnerships, that's where it starts to fall apart. So working with those partners to make sure that you have exactly, what you need and not any more and not any less. And so that's where we've found a lot of value working with Accela to find these solutions so that it is broad enough to meet our customers' needs.
That's great. And a quick follow-up around just software as a service. So, we hear often about digital services and cloud, and what role does having software as a service approach have in kind of your overall digital services strategy?
It's critical. I mean, for cost, we found that it is, it's one of the more affordable solutions as we go forward. We don't have those unlimited budgets, but when you're going through and you're doing that SaaS approach and using those operation dollars in order to fund it, that's something that we found that we that it's more affordable than going through and buying all the infrastructure and maintaining the workforce in order to keep that infrastructure up and running. Also the speed. I mean, getting from having the regulation dry to actually implementing it, we couldn't find something faster aside from SaaS and working with Accela. And so that has been a huge value, being able to have the conversation related to the regulation and then being able to deliver it to the public in a fast way rather than having to go in and develop it on your own for for an extended period. And also the reliability. I mean, we found that the reliability has been, very, very remarkable because all of those other challenges aren't being engaged with, or they've been thought of by the experts and resolved before they actually are brought to market. So those are really kind of the three tenets that we have found and why we've kind of started to go to the direction of SaaS with Acela.
That's great. And a quick audience question follow-up for you. What partners have been critical as an aspect of that transformation?
Specifically looking at the short-term rental component, Acela has been a huge partner. Also working with a lot of our other municipal operators in order to get an understanding of the challenges that they're facing, because absolutely, if we haven't faced it already, we definitely will. In the share economy, everybody talks, and that's something that we, in working with some of our partners back east, they said, "Oh, take a look at this component," and sure enough, within days of them identifying it, we identified it, and we started to work with Acela and started to work with some of our enforcement partners in order to find a solution.
Great. Well, I'm going to bring Jay in now. And Jay, the technology adoption in the public sector used to take years, and now digital service capabilities can be procured and really deployed in a matter of months. What's driving this shift?
What we've seen, I'll just share an example. We had a great solution coming out of a pilot at our airport, SFO, helping blind people navigate through the airport. And I was just amazed seeing the solution built by a young company in 4 months, and seeing a woman from a local nonprofit navigate without any assistance to the gate. And so it took SFO 2.5 years to issue a RFP to finally acquire technology like that. And that's just way too long. And so we've seen just over the past several years a big interest in streamlining procurement. And I'll go back to Governor Newsom. On his first day in office, he could do a lot of different things, he decided to focus on procurement and really streamlining that, making that more collaborative. And I think you're seeing a lot of jurisdictions looking at that, because when you're looking at technology, obviously it's evolving very rapidly. And as you mentioned earlier in your opening slides, there's an expectation with government, and that goes to trust. If governments aren't able to deliver these services in a way that people get and understand and it's accessible, you're going to quickly lose that trust. Second, on the deployment side, we're seeing two big trends. We're seeing a lot of cloud-based solutions. So all of the startups that we work with, the 40-some startups that are working with governments, nearly all of those solutions are cloud-based SaaS solutions. Second, we're seeing deployment-ready solutions. So these are best-of-breed solutions focusing on very specific issues that are big problems for cities. And again, through that collaborative model, really building out that solution. But that best-of-breed, there's a lot of power there. I think with bigger players, I think Acela's done a great job here. They've done things like civic solutions that just require some minor tweaks to deploy, and their civic applications, which are fully turnkey, really brings that time to market and really getting that implemented down to zero. And that's reducing risk. When you think about big technology implementations, it's one thing to buy them, which can often take time, and let's make that quicker. But that implementation phase is really, really important. So having the tools and technologies and the mindset of doing that rapidly, experimenting, learning quickly is really, really important.
So one question that came in from the audience was kind of a statement, but I want to get your reaction to it. Shouldn't every city government today have someone in the mayor's office that has the title Digital Experience Officer, totally focused on the ways that folks can get services on all devices? And I think the question here is, who ultimately should be responsible for looking at digital services in the experience of government? Is it a singular position, a digital experience officer, or is it a function of the CIO or the chief innovation officer? I'd love to get your take.
First of all, I think that's a great statement. I do think there needs to be a senior leader focused on that. And if you think about your website, and how many people go to your website. First of all, a lot of cities are not tracking the analytics, so they should at least measure what's going on. But then share that with your city manager. If they knew that, hundreds of thousands or millions of people are coming to your website, that is your front door. If you had that same number of people coming to City Hall, you would definitely see a big investment from government to make sure that things are moving quickly. So why aren't we doing that with digital infrastructure? And I think that's really, really important to have a point person whose job is to really catalyze change for the broader organization, to look at best practices, to implement them, to work with peer cities. But then it is a responsibility for everybody else, whoever is drafting policies, whoever is driving operations, to really be focused on their residents, their constituents, and making sure that our goals, whatever we do, are aligned around that. So yes, you have an asset management system, but that asset management system is really around making sure you're delivering services to your constituents. So never losing sight of that, and always tying back whatever you're doing, even if it's an internal facing application, it may not seem like there's a direct line, but there is. And so making sure people are very clear about that. But I think that's a really great statement that the audience member made.
Fantastic. So I want to bring Brian into the conversation again. Brian, we talked about SaaS and software as a service. Why is it such a prevalent conversation in government today?
Yeah, no, and we see it in the vast majority of our engagements with customers. It used to not be the case, as there were concerns about data ownership, security, performance, sort of being the main reasons for any hesitation that we used to experience. But the industry is really focused on those areas, working with hosting companies and so forth, and they're essentially resolved. And so now the benefits of SaaS are clearly outweighing on-premises deployment. There are many reasons, but the primary benefit really is agility. New regulations, as we've talked about, require that agility with agencies tasked with managing them, and the big custom-built solutions hosted in-house are just not agile enough to accommodate the rate of change. And it really comes down to the burden of managing a data center. Agencies that host their own apps have to worry about hardware infrastructure such as servers and storage, software infrastructure such as operating systems, databases, security and compliance software, and then the applications sit on top of that. And when you add all the periodic upgrades and updates, it's quite a burden for in-house IT organizations. In some cases, we've seen 50 to 70% of total IT spend focused on infrastructure in the data center. And we call this KTLO, or keeping the lights on. And with SaaS, obviously, the burden of the data center is taken care of, so agencies can focus on new and innovative ways to create solutions to help citizens. They can focus on creating new services and not maintaining infrastructure. And they can also deploy solutions faster and focus on extending or enhancing existing apps for new regulations more quickly, again, because the infrastructure is provided for them. And getting back to the concerns about security, performance, etc., we find that SaaS environments actually provide higher levels of these things now than do most on-prem deployments. Server scalability and advanced security and compliance capabilities and features are really hard, actually, for agencies to implement on their own, but are provided, obviously, in SaaS environments. So also with automatic updates, agencies are always on the newest software, the latest releases, and with all of these capabilities, versus being locked into an older version of the software due to high degrees of customization or just not having the resources. So, these are the conversations that we're having, and really it's getting to the point now where when we engage customers and prospects, we're not having to sell them on the benefits of SaaS. They're starting to realize a lot of this on their own.
And from an industry perspective, how are you seeing SaaS better prepare agencies for some of these future regulatory challenges?
Yeah, I think when you think of the future, and if you think of building a large custom solution that a number of the speakers have talked about, maintainability and extensibility and changes are extremely challenging. So SaaS provides the maintainability of applications going forward. It removes much of the upgrades and updates burdens from the agencies, which is huge. Speed and time to market for the technologies, we've talked a lot about that, the agility. Security and safety, which is becoming more difficult all the time due to sophistication of threats. And also gearing up for things like the collaboration that I mentioned earlier with application frameworks that are more standardized and structured. When solutions are on the same infrastructure and versions, they are more viable for cross-agency data sharing than custom one-off solutions. And then finally, the ability to focus more on citizens with better services, better service levels, and that's the key driver for most digital modernization and transformation efforts. So the SaaS value propositions, if you will, really extend well into the future versus, maintaining data centers on premise.
Fantastic. So with that, I want to roll into our last section, which is around digital tools, best practices, and benefits. And I know we've got a lot of questions kind of related to the tactics and some strategy elements that we'll dive into from the audience. So audience, keep those questions rolling in. In a survey that we facilitated with Accela, one of the things that we saw as far as the benefits to SaaS from a service delivery standpoint, the primary benefit, improved efficiency, followed by reduced time to deliver new service, followed by kind of the whole improvement of citizen experience, data analytics capabilities, and you can see the list as it goes on. So there's definitely a movement towards, SaaS, not just from an operational standpoint, but also recognition of some of the benefits that come along with that. And Brian, we'll start with you for this one. Accela has kind of been at the forefront of modernizing a lot of these digital services. What are some of the steps you should take to ensure success as it relates to that? And are there any elements agencies should consider when starting their own digital service journey? And does it vary based on agency size? If you're an agency under 90,000 people, for example, is that journey different than a larger agency?
Yeah, I think the journey has to be looked at from the onset as the same. It's the same kind of, some of the things that we've talked about. But then clearly the size and scale then inform and drive decisions as you get further into the details, such as the infrastructure elements, the scalability aspects of it, the deployments, those kinds of things. So my sense is it depends, but I think generally the core components, the foundation of a digital transformation, journey really has to take on the major functions. And we've, including some of the things I mentioned before, looking at the larger process, not just automating the manual process using the same steps and functions used today, which is very tempting for agencies. But as I mentioned, we have those conversations right out of the gate. The second is something that we are seeing more and more of, and that is shifting of the mindset away from wanting the custom one-off solutions that may appear to meet the needs of an agency, but are customized to the point that they can be very hard to maintain, upgrade, and evolve over time. And I think everyone's touched on that a little bit. And I just want to take a second and talk about the mindset, because there are examples of where we've engaged agencies and their mindset was clearly, we do it this way. We know you can custom build our solution. You have a platform, and we do the long-term discovery aspect of it. Go off, build us our solution. It can take months and months and months, if not years, and then come back and we'll have exactly what we want. And, that mindset just used to be the norm for state and local agencies. And the shift is now more to more packaged solutions. And we've mentioned the civic applications or civic solutions. And what we do is we talk to them, we show them what we've built, what our experiences have been, describe some of the maintainability challenges of building highly customized solutions on top of a full-featured platform, and then talk about more out-of-the-box solutions which are pre-configured, really pre-built, and will meet the needs with some degree of configuration, not customization. That's a big, I want to emphasize the word configuration within the frameworks or guardrails, if you will, of an application. We find that many agencies are are fine with that configuration within the frameworks of a full-featured solution. They don't have to go out and start doing high degrees of customization and scripting, and which then drives those challenges downstream. So the results of this mindset change is really significant benefits in maintainability, supportability, and as well as total cost of ownership over time.
So an audience question that came in was around, do you have any examples of some of these turnkey deployment-ready solutions that you can kind of call out?
I'll call out one. We just finished a case study on this, so I know it's very public, but it's Culver City and it's cannabis, and they had this conversation with us, which was essentially, we want to have you custom build our cannabis solution. We think it should be doing this and that and the other thing, and it wasn't that they were wrong. In any sense, it was they put a lot of time and energy into thinking how would it work best for them, and that also kind of comes back to your question. For the larger agencies, the larger jurisdictions versus the smaller, there are differences, and so an agency will analyze deeply what they want, and so they engage us on that, and we perform the discovery process. But when it came, when we started demonstrating the cannabis regulation specific application, which again are these out-of-the-box pre-built solutions, they came around, and then they did decide to revise the project to the civic application. At a high level, the results were our initial discovery and estimate of the services associated with building their custom solution was cut in half at the proposal stage, and then the actual implementation, and we've just gone live, was far less than that, significantly less than that. So it's a mindset change. It's really going to where we do like the idea of benefiting from the experience a company like Accela has, and we can perhaps adopt ourselves a little bit to those frameworks, but in the long run, the value is significant in going that direction.
Great. So Dominic, I want to bring you back into the conversation. So we're talking best practices and kind of the tactics involved. So what was Denver's playbook for deploying a solution for short-term rentals so quickly?
I think the first component was really having the engagement with our customers and being able to understand their needs and their challenges when it came to licensing, which were different than from the regulatory perspective what we thought that they wanted. So really engaging with them, engaging with their community, and building a partnership of trust so that we knew what they were asking for. Then working with Accela on the platform to look at the record and say, okay, this is something that is really important to our community. And while in their world of wants, they'd have this highly configurable or highly customized module, saying, really, how can we configure it? How can we make this text or make this existing tool meet the needs of that customer base and being able to deliver that to them? So that was something that was really important to get us going before we even launched, making sure that we understood how it worked and how we could deliver it. And then meeting the customer base where they were, being able to say, okay, we're starting to regulate an online space. We need to meet them online. We need to make sure that this entire transaction from the moment that they log in to the moment that they actually get their business license is seamless, making sure that it delivers that high level expectation. Because yet again, the customers are looking at us and they say, okay, government, and they've got perhaps some preconceived notions of how government should function. And then they've got, these really slick hosting platforms. And they say, I want that. I want this slick platform. And being able to deliver that and being able to, leverage the partnership and say, okay, I understand what you're looking for, and being able to work with Accela and say, this is what we need, and get it delivered. That was critical. And again, leveraging that existing certain amounts of online transactions. How can we translate that into this brand new sphere? And how can we deliver that in a quick way? I mean, ultimately, we wanted to make sure that when the customers were coming in, they would be able to get their license during that same transaction. They'd be able to apply and get an affirmative, yes, you have your license, all within the transaction. And we didn't want it to take too long. And so that was one of those critical learning loops that we sat down and put a lot of thought and a lot of foresight into it.
That's great. Y'all are definitely kind of at the forefront of digital services there. So I do want to bring Jay back in as we're getting close to the end of time. And Jay, you work with agencies across the country, you work with startups. Are there common practices that you're coaching agencies on to help ensure successful delivery of digital services?
Yeah, a big part of this is that culture change. And I mentioned this earlier, being really focused on the user. So thinking about your constituent, or if it's your frontline staff, really understanding their needs and having that conversation with them, engaging them is really, really important. The other piece that we focus on is being agile, this idea of experimentation. And, how do we actually take small steps forward and iterate through the process? Because these challenges are evolving, right? When you think about cannabis regulation, the rules are changing all the time. So making sure that you've got sort of an agile mindset that, hey, this is not going to be something that's going to be fixed for the rest of time, that it's going to be evolving. And that mindset is really different than what people are accustomed to. So these perspectives, these approaches are becoming more and more commonplace, but we've seen so many people get turned on to design thinking, going through a workshop, having that facilitation, really unpacking a problem area, using these modern methodologies. And, whether it's in technology context or more broadly, these approaches we think are great ways to solve problems. And at the end of the day, this is what the work that we're all doing, digital transformation, about is really solving problems.
Awesome. So a quick follow-up that came in, I would love to get your take and then Dominic's take, is around engaging customers in the process. So when you think about, digital service transformation and this whole aspect of kind of reinventing the model of service delivery in government, what role do you encourage agencies to take when it comes to engaging their customers in that process?
It's really hard, the cultural change there. It's one thing to say be user-focused. We had some work we were doing in San Francisco on homelessness, and we made the suggestion, hey, let's actually bring in some homeless people into our project team, sort of to give us guidance. And one response was, why would we ever do that? And that mindset needs to shift. And I think there needs to be more plug-and-play options to doing that. If you're in the private sector, you can create incentives, reward cards, things like that. But in the public sector, you don't have that. So I think there needs to be some infrastructure to make it easier to do user research.
And Dominic, I'd love to get your kind of take on this as well from the Denver standpoint. What role does engagement play in your digital service transformation?
Engagement's critical. Before we even started to really launch, we engaged with our stakeholders at the regulatory perspective, so that we said, okay, this is the challenge, this is the issue that we're looking to solve, and have them have a seat at the table. Let the operators have a seat at the table when you're discussing the regulatory framework. And then once you're transitioning from the regulatory framework into the implementation and the operations, you want to invite them back and make sure that what you heard was in fact accurate, and be able to make some tweaks and early failures so that you can provide a lasting success. One of the critical components that we found early on was the website was slick. It worked really well for them. However, some of the messaging, some of the help text was in fact a detriment. And so being able to get their eyes on it and get their perspective, we're able to easily recover and correct that moving forward.
All right, well said. Well, I want to be respectful of our 1 hour commitment, so we're going to have to wrap up this lively discussion here. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for today's event, and a big thank you goes out to my fellow speakers, Dominic, Jay, and Brian. Thanks so much for sharing your expertise. And a special thanks to our partners at Accela for enabling us to have this conversation today. And we look forward to seeing you again at another governing webinar. Just a reminder, we'll be sending out a copy of the deck as well. But thanks so much for joining us today. Have a great week.